Hello, hello. I'm so happy today to have Jenny Garbis, the founder of Mission Good. So, Jenny, you don't know this, but Alex and I have been speaking about having somebody like you who can guide a founder's journey, in terms of raising capital, in terms of putting them out there. So, we are so excited about this conversation because it's going to enlighten so many people who hear the podcast. So, thank you for agreeing to be on the show.
You're very welcome. I'm excited to be here.
Super. So I'm going to start with Jenny, the person. Talk to us about growing up and what your influences were that led to all the various things that you do today. Were the early influences that you can think about that kind of shaped this future?
Yes, I think that's a very big question and a prominent one to start with. I think there's lots of ways I could answer that, but one of the things that is sticking out most in my mind is I remember being in a classroom at school, and I remember having this image of wind farms and solar energy farms put to us when I was probably maybe 12 years old. And I felt so amazed by it, this kind of future that we could build that would be more ethical, reduce our air pollution, etc. And that stuck in my mind for a few years. I come from quite an entrepreneurial family. So my uncle runs his own business, my grandfather ran his own business, my mum runs her own business. So I think I've always had that real entrepreneurial spirit, and I just absolutely love innovation. I love working with founders, and I love working with investors too. So I feel like I'm in a really lovely place in my life at the moment where I'm working across all those different things. And then in terms of sort of my sustainability journey and what's shaped that as well. So I mentioned that kind of memory when I was 12, but also then moving into my degree, I did business studies for my undergrad. And as part of my dissertation, I decided to look into financing for renewable energy companies. And back then, that was, God, how old was I? Maybe it was like 2014, 2015. And I really looked quite heavily into that and became very interested in sustainability. So even from then, where I would say sustainability wasn't talked about as much as it is certainly today, I had that deep interest, and I ended up actually winning a university research grant to then publish my research in the form of an ebook. And back then, ebooks were also not that commonplace. So I published that, and that's sold around the world. Not huge volumes, but it's sold around the world in Japan and America and stuff like that. So it has picked up some interest, which is great to see. And then sort of fast forwarding years later, I ended up working at lots of different startup companies. And it was important to me that all of them had some sort of mission driven or purpose led element to them. And of course, most of those happen to be either sustainability related companies or healthcare companies, mental health tech companies. I had some pretty interesting experiences doing that in commercial roles, so sort of sales and marketing, etc. And one particular company that I worked for had a really large exit, so it was sold for over 400 million Canadian dollars to a Canadian company, and then it was acquired again after that. That was around sort of 2018, 2019. And I actually took some time off, and I wanted to explore the world, so I did a bit of that. And then I decided that I wanted to do a master's in experimental psychology, but actually specializing in pro-environmental behavior. And so I went and did that, and I looked specifically at electric vehicle adoption. And I found that particularly interesting. And I looked at things like celebrity endorsement and the role of that in making people want to buy an electric vehicle. Loads and loads more I could tell you on that. But I would say that that's something that I did. And then after that, I decided that psychology is something that I have a deep, deep passion for, and I'm super interested in it. And I think it applies to any career, because in any career you're working with people, and the psychology is obviously the understanding of people. But I decided that I wanted to go back into the business world, back to working with and in startups. And I ended up at a sustainability communications organization called Futerra, which some people on the podcast, the listeners may have heard of. It's basically a sustainability consultancy, but within it, they also had what they called a climate venture builder. And there I was building and launching climate-related startups. One was in sustainability training for corporates, so the likes of Burberry we trained, for example. And then a second one was a JV with Mars, as in the chocolate bar Mars. But what people might not know about Mars is that they have a huge pet care business within the overall business. And so we partnered with Mars Pet Care to produce a lower impact, low environmental impact pet food product, which was called Love Bug, which was for cats. And I'm answering this question in a very long way, but basically that's my kind of journey up until that point. And then shortly after that, I went self-employed, and I'll leave it there for now.
Yeah, there's so much to unpack, and then thank you for doing that, because I did have these as individual questions too. So we will dive into each of those. But thank you to that solar farm, that took your fancy and then took you on this trajectory. But there are more interesting bits in your life. Let's talk about your experience at appearing in The Apprentice. What was that about, and how did you get there, and how did that happen, and what was that experience, and how did it shape your life?
Yeah, it's funny, I never tend to mention. I mean, what you've just heard me do is talk through obviously my career history, but also my own history. And you probably noticed that I missed that out in part of my journey. But yeah, I'm more than happy to talk about it. And obviously, was a big thing that I did a few years ago. So really, my ambition there was to take the research that I'd done at university with that research grant that I mentioned, that ebook I published, and use that to create a business plan around financing renewable energy companies. So I created that. And then, I mean, everyone around me had always said, you should go on The Apprentice, you should go on The Apprentice, because I think I'm just that sort of personality type. And I had always not really taken it that seriously. And then during my final year at university, so it's like sort of my last, it was my last year, but just before the final year exam, so it's probably about halfway through my final year, I basically was scrolling on Twitter one day and saw that it was the final day to apply. So I decided to apply and, went to the London auditions. And I'm not actually allowed to say too much about the process because we have to sign a contract literally about this thick. But basically, I ended up sort of getting through all these rounds. And before I knew it, I was being offered to go on the show. And I thought I would do well. I don't know if I expected to get offered the place, because there's also a reserves list. I thought I might get on the reserves list. I wasn't expecting to necessarily be directly offered one of the main candidate spots. And I remember exactly when it happened. I was in a lecture and my phone went off and I knew the number and I thought, oh my God, they've called me. It's going to be a yes or a no. So I left my lecture and there was no one outside at all. It was just me on the phone, and obviously everyone else was in the lecture hall. And I answered the phone and they offered it to me. And I thought, okay, this is quite a big moment in my life. Like, do I take this opportunity and see where it leads me, or do I turn it down, finish the rest of my final year, and then figure out what I'm going to do after university? Or I wanted to start my own business, obviously. And I decided to take it because I thought, if I don't take it, I'm always going to wonder what would have happened. So I went into the experience and I actually loved it. I thought the people were amazing, really entrepreneurial, as you can imagine, extremely driven, hungry, passionate people. But also some people that did want to make a difference, either for themselves and their families or for like a cause. And obviously for me, it was about going in for a cause. And without going into too much detail, it was obviously a bit of a whirlwind. You hardly sleep. They take away everything from you, your phone. You're not even allowed to have a book to read at night. It's very, very strict. But I came out of that experience and actually got a couple of business mentors that I've met through the process, who are still my business mentors today, however many years later that is, 8 years later or something, which is really lovely that I've still got them in my life. And I suppose I achieved what I wanted to achieve somewhat. I didn't end up starting my business because unfortunately I didn't win the show. But I was able to spread awareness of the cause. So I went on other podcasts, actually, such as ed.net, which anyone who's interested in sustainability should know ed.net. And if you don't, it's a fantastic publication. I read it every single morning still. So I was able to do that. And yeah, I mean, I've sort of, did various press. I was in, having various press releases, various interviews. And then I did the most random stuff, like I opened a chocolate factory with Princess Anne. Like the things that you get invited to after being on a show like that is just wild, and you couldn't imagine it. But yeah, and then I basically I was offered a few other opportunities in TV shows, but not aligned with what I wanted to do, which was obviously sustainability and to make a difference in the world. So I then went back into the startup scene, and you've kind of heard the rest of my journey from there.
So you seem to have a really strong core. You seem to know what you want, and you're able to kind of push back on things you don't want in your life. Where did that come from? What I normally, and you are a psychologist in a way, so you probably have thought about this a little bit, but I normally find that probably comes from childhood or parents or something where you're very grounded. So can you point a finger on that how did this core of Jenny happen?
I think it's a really interesting question. I would probably say my parents raised me and my brother to be like fiercely independent. So from a young age, we were, being taught about how to manage our money and things like that. But I don't know. I think a lot of it, and I, I'm a bit of a psychologist, and I obviously have studied it, and I think a lot of it is actually personality type. I think, and I think also the way that I would build trust with someone is to do things that align with my values and meet the promises that I've made to them. And so I almost feel like that's what I'm doing with the communities that I'm in, with the clients that I serve, with the people that I work with, and almost like my promise to Earth. But I also think, I think I am going to mention this because I personally found it very impactful in my life. When I was going through this process of, I'm going to say like self-discovery, I mentioned I took some time off, like went traveling, decided to research and investigate in more in the psychology world. I came across a framework, I suppose, that really impacted me, and it's Ikigai. And I think Ikigai is something that a lot more, you've just smiled, so you probably know it, but a lot more people are familiar with this. But essentially, it's a Japanese proverb, really, that is also a framework to discover your reason for being. Ikigai, roughly translated, is your reason for being, i.e., your purpose. And there's sort of 4 elements to the diagram. If you just give it a quick Google while you're listening to the podcast, you can have a look at the diagram. And for anyone that's not sure what I like to call your North Star is, this is a really good way to find it. And I think it's true that I've always felt very strongly that I wanted to make a difference in the world. But sometimes you don't know what form that comes in. So some people might do it through being a doctor and providing really good healthcare to, say, cancer patients, for example. Some people might find that purpose through looking after their young family. People find it in all different ways. But I think for me, I wanted to look at the greatest issues in our society. One of them is sustainability, the circular economy, etc. Another I think we've got a really big problem with mental health. And obviously in this country, the link between physical and mental health is not very good in the NHS. So people aren't getting the support that they need. So there's lots of, you sort of list out all of the things that the world needs to be better and for people to live happier, healthier lives. And for me, I felt very connected to sustainability, but also it matched. So once you've picked your cause, you then need to think about your skill set. And for me, it's like project management, relationship building. I'm highly commercial, et cetera, et cetera. And so for me, starting Mission Good a year and a half ago, it was sort of the work that I've already been doing, but I'm now just doing it for myself, and I have clients. But I'm basically helping purpose-led businesses that are also profit-led businesses be successful through helping them with their commercials and fundraising, etc. So I think I'm sort of answering your question, but I think the reality is I was sort of born this way. I've just always felt very, very strongly that if we're put on the planet, and I can't remember the stat, but it's like, 1 in 100 trillion or something chance that we're actually even on the planet in the first place, we should take the opportunity to add value while we're here. And I just feel very strongly that I want to do that through the work that I do and my Ikigai.
Yeah, it's just cool that you realized it quite early in life, because I find that, and I remember once, it's so interesting, and this is 10, 15 years back, but I was speaking to a room full of CEOs. It was 150 CEOs. And I asked the same question. How many of you know your purpose? Jenny, you wouldn't believe it. 150 CEOs, not one hand went up. They
Not a
were
single
all doing
hand.
the job. And what a life, right? It's such an empty life if you're not doing that, because I know that my life, similar to yours, much later than you, got transformed with that very idea of what am I here for, and that kind of exploration. And one of my gurus, coaches, who kind of taught me a lot and still does, and one of the things that he said was, your life is not about yourself, it's about the contributions that you're going to make. And in a way, it's the similar thing that you were talking about. And the other thing that came to my mind was, you talked about you the idea of why you went into Apprentice, whether you want to, you don't want that in your head that you could have done it, kind of thing. So there's an Indian poet who I love from the 15th century called Kabir, and one of his couplets, he speaks in couplets, and one of his couplets, it's better to do and regret than not do and regret. So it's such an interesting thought, right? And that's something that stayed with me as well. Okay, so I'm going to go into some random things like Emma Watson. You talk about Emma Watson as an inspiration. Talk more about that.
Wow, that must have been a very old article. But it's true. I think she's great. I think she's great as a role model. I think she's, an independent woman. She's spoken at UN summits, etc., on the issue around feminism. I'm also a big fan of Harry Potter, which helps. But I think her as an individual, she's also trying to add value to society. And I say she speaks on the topic of feminism, which is something that's close to my heart. I mean, I actually struggled a bit this morning because I read an article that, I mean, it's hard, right? Because as a woman, you're bombarded with really negative statistics, I would say actually every day. And this morning, someone that I follow, a man actually, who set up a business to help female founders get investment, spoke to a woman called Brooke. I can't remember her last name, but this woman, Brooke, spoke at the Sifted Summit yesterday. I don't know if you saw, lots of people attended the Sifted Summit. And there was a talk about the results of a survey for female founders that had just been through a fundraise. And 89% of female founders experienced sexual harassment in the fundraising journey. And I felt like I've been hit by a bullet when you hear stats like that. It's really, really hard. And I also wanted to dissect it. So I actually messaged the person that did the post, and I put a couple of comments underneath it. And apparently it's even when women are feeling unsafe, or, investors can ask women out to dinner and things like that. That counts as sexual harassment because it's inappropriate. So it's all inclusive of that. But so all of that is to say that we haven't solved the issue of equality at all. And that comment I made about Emma Watson and feminism, which must have been literally between 8 and 10 years ago, it's still relevant today. Like, I still admire the people that are speaking up about the issue. And this woman, Brooke, I wish I could remember her last name, but she's created this company called Safe Raise off the back of this survey. And she experienced, unfortunately, sexual harassment in her fundraising journey. And she's created this company to basically help women raise safely. I mean, I actually haven't experienced that recently, and I do a lot of fundraising and I speak to a lot of investors, but I suppose now you have a lot more calls with investors, whereas previously you would have a lot more in-person meetings. And they also talk about the power dynamic between the investor and the founder. And I actually don't want to speak about this for too long, because I think what we need to be doing is encouraging female founders to go out and raise and to start their businesses. And I don't want to put anyone off. I think it's just making people aware of the fact that these things can still happen. And even on a call today, I had a call with an investor earlier, and the call was going well, but they hadn't acknowledged that I needed to do an introduction on the call. So I paused the call halfway through and said, by the way, I'd just like to introduce myself. And I made a point of, like, you do have to speak up for yourself. So I made a point of sort of, by the way, this is my background. It's great to meet you. Just wanted to understand more about your investment thesis and your criteria. And they then responded to me, and it went well. And then, and things are fine. But I do think that we have to stick up for ourselves, and the people around us also need to stick up for us.
Yeah, my wife actually just lives for that singular purpose of equality. So, and I'm a father of three girls. So true blue feminist at heart. And this is a topic that really does affect me significantly when I hear of this. And 89% is crazy. So
I
so
can
I'll
believe
have
it.
to dig more. And I'm going to look at. I looked at. I noted down set of safe raise as well. So I'll have a look at it. So thank you for that. Couple of things before we dive into the meat and potatoes of what you do. You talked about your break and travel. So this is like your eat, pray, love kind of moment. So what was that, and how did that? So where did you go, and how did that bring value into what you do today? Again, how did that provide you with more insights?
Yeah, I suppose it's an interesting one. I don't talk too much about my travel on a podcast like this, but I suppose it is an important part of my journey, and I think it really helps with perspective as well. So yeah, I mean, I've always wanted to travel. I love experiencing new cultures. I think that you can learn a lot from different countries around the world, different people, um, and I suppose I did travel quite a lot during that period of time. I spent time with certain like minority cultures and tribes in the hills of Myanmar and parts of Africa and things like that. And I absolutely loved to understand their world. And I mean, there really is some very extreme poverty in the world. And so every day I'm grateful for having been born in the UK and even have a roof over my head, actually. And so I think it definitely puts more gratitude in your life when you travel. But also, a lot of these people were very happy, and actually, like, their purpose is more around their family and their communities, and that's how they find their joy. Um, I would also like to say that I did travel in that period of time, but actually over the last 5 years, I've only taken 2 return flights for environmental reasons. So I've tried to balance out the fact that I have done a bit of traveling with not traveling as much of late. Obviously, part of that was COVID, but I've actively not taken flights, and I've actually tried to explore the UK more at the moment. And I'll sort of go to Oxford or Cambridge at the weekends instead to get out and experience the world in a different way. But yeah, I mean, I suppose my trip was profound and interesting. But I really think that the most profound bit was more looking into the psychology and understanding consumer behavior and just general behavior. Because if you want to create change, you need to understand where we're at now. And so I think the journey that I've been on to establish my Ikigai is probably more something that I speak about versus the travel. But travel definitely helps you with gratitude and perspective.
Yeah, and I think it just widens your horizons. One of the sayings is that you either have, when you're traveling, you either have good experiences or good stories, so, or
Mm.
both. So those are the only kind of situations that you get into. And of course, my wife and I are nomads, total nomads, and I travel almost 50% of my time. So my
Oh,
kids
wow.
actually pull my leg on this whole idea of taking so many flights. And, of course, I'm in sustainability, and they're like, where does your sustainability angle go there? And I'm like, okay, how do I solve this? I cannot do these things over Zoom calls. We're setting up a factory in Guatemala. We have operations in India, and other things, and it has to be feet on the ground. But that's a question I've not answered for myself. I'm going to dig a little bit deeper on your choice of going into experimental psychology after business studies. That's a significant kind of, it could be an addition rather than a shift. But what made you think that this is something that will add to your ikigai? And let's bring it into that idea and understand that, and then get deeper into again what the things that you're doing.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if it's going to be anything different to what I've said already, but I think just broadening your horizons, understanding people is one of the best things that you can do in your personal and professional life. And really, like, I had the opportunity to take some time off after the exit and basically just explore other interests. And, we're all multifaceted people. We like multiple things. So I'm interested in psychology and the environment, but I'm also very interested in psychology. Yeah, so I just wanted to explore another interest, basically. And then I ultimately decided that actually I wanted to go back into business and be in the more commercial world and like help mission driven and purpose led founders to commercialize their businesses and grow and succeed so that we can create the change that we need. But I absolutely still use the psychology principles every day. But even before I did my master's, I was actually reading psychology textbooks. I was like attending different webinars. I did psychology for A level, so it's been a consistent interest as well.
Okay. Okay. So let's get into the companies that you worked with, and that's really interesting because they align with what you've been doing. But the ideas that were brought in by Futera, Cedars, and then of course Gusto Group, and all of that, and of course lots of it is about getting investment for founders and other ideas. But tell us about those experiences, and why did you choose them, and how did they help you move forward in your career?
So I think in terms of why I chose them, it's always to do with the mission, right? So they always need to have a positive impact. Some of the companies you've mentioned are part of more of my mission good work. So like some of those are clients that I work with as part of mission good. But yeah, most of them I would say were kind of scalable tech startups for the most part. There were a couple of D2C brands in there. But they were always trying to improve the world in one way or another. I think particularly one business that I worked at, a mental health solution, the one that was acquired, I remember, we used to read the Google reviews of the users of the solution. And there was one person that said, and it is quite sad, it's very sad, but they said, I wouldn't be here if it weren't for insert company name. So there are people that it had a really huge impact on. And so obviously you read those reviews and it drives you forward to sell more of the product and get more people using it. And we were selling into businesses. So the end consumer wasn't having to pay anything. This is, and actually I want to talk about this because I don't think enough people know about this, but the majority of companies, 97% of companies in the UK have an EAP, an employee assistance program. So anyone that's listening, if you're having financial difficulties, legal issues, if you're ever in like a domestically abusive relationship, if you're just struggling because you've had you're going through grief, or you've been through a breakup, or you're having an argument with your friend, anything that's affecting your mental health, find your employee assistance program number. Everything is completely confidential for you, and you can ring that number. You can speak directly to somebody that will triage you to speak to a therapist for free. This is an end benefit that your company pays for. So yeah, I really encourage people to use it. And the business that I worked for that I mentioned, that was what they provided. It was more of a total wellbeing solution. So we were looking at proactive healthcare, but the sort of core of the product was the employee assistance program. And whenever I hear anyone that's even in my personal network that's got an issue, I sort of remind them that that's the benefit that they get, because it's super underutilized. So before we had embedded our product in the UK market, employee assistance programs were used between 0 and 5% in the workforce. So hardly anyone actually uses them, but mostly because they're not aware of the solution. So we were trying to basically create posters around the office for people to see the number, and we had an app that people could download. So yeah, I mean, I'm getting into a lot of detail, but I want to share that because I always take the opportunity to tell people that they have that resource available to them. So yeah, you can probably tell I'm very passionate about the companies that I do work for and the end outcome. And I always like to try and create some sort of metric so that I can say, okay, by working there, I, impacted X amount of lives, or I saved X kilograms of waste, or whatever. So yeah, I'm quite a big numbers person. And I would also encourage anyone that's listening to this podcast to do that perhaps in your own roles and for your own businesses. I mean, I know we haven't got into talking about fundraising at the moment, but there are some impact funds, in fact, a lot of impact funds that will ask you to quantify the contribution that you're making. So whether it is, if you're trying to reduce single-use plastic through a new type of seaweed container or something, how many single-use items, I guess, are you saving from landfill with your product, and always try and quantify the value that you're giving.
Yeah, those are all good points, and I hope that the other countries also have programs like EAP, and then like people can probably reach out, and we don't know about them. So thank you for bringing that up, and I'm sure some of the listeners would benefit through that idea. Okay, let's get into Mission Good now. So why you've worked for these wonderful companies and clearly haven't had an impact, and you choose companies very carefully, and of course create your contribution within that scope, but why go out on your own at all, number one? And number two, tell us more about the idea of Mission Good and the areas that you cover, and what are the priorities there?
Sure. So the first one, why did I found it in the first place? So I suppose it's probably fairly obvious from our conversation so far that I'm very entrepreneurial and I've always wanted my own business. And I've had millions of ideas. I have a spreadsheet full of them. I have notebooks full of them, but I've never taken the leap. I mean, I've done sort of side hustles, but I've never taken the leap into like a fully fledged business of my own before. What has worked very well is me working directly with entrepreneurs and founders and investors. And I thought, actually, why don't I just do that, but for myself? So I sort of wanted to try it, see how it would work. And it's worked very, very well. Like, I'm basically at capacity now. That's sort of one version of the story. The other version of the story is that it happens slightly more naturally than that, which is that I was doing some volunteering for one company. Through that, I met the chairman of the firm, who I worked very, very well with. And I was basically employed on a day rate basis, i.e., being self-employed. And I still work with him to this day, which is a year and a half ago. And yeah, so it was sort of a natural progression as well. Like, I started working on an initial 3-month contract with that initial client, and then through meeting the chairman, I then started working for his company, and I still work with him now. And then from there, I then thought, oh, actually, I want to try and work with other companies now, and I've won other clients, and I sort of offer, consultancy, and I can go into the specific services if that's helpful or appropriate here.
Oh,
Um,
absolutely. No, no, no.
oh,
Please do.
okay.
Please do. The areas that you want to cover, and of course, to know how Mission Good kind of works and what is
Yeah,
the
yeah.
focus.
So I think from my sales experience, obviously you always want to focus on the pain and the need of the person that you're speaking to. And because my skill set is quite varied, the way that I tend to run sales calls, and I'm quite lucky that a lot of my leads are inbound or through referrals, but I'll get into a call with someone and I'm very strict to running to an agenda. So I'll sort of set out the agenda, but then most of the call is me then doing discovery to understand, the areas they're struggling with, what is their skill set, because of course some founders are very, very scientific. Maybe they've got a biochemistry background, or maybe they're not very, or maybe they're very technical, but sometimes they need someone to come in and support with the commercial side of it. So maybe that's something that I'm fulfilling for them. Sometimes they're a hard to abate industry that wants to become more purpose led. Sometimes they're a startup that's extremely purpose led but really needs help with financing. So I basically use all of those calls to understand where the entrepreneur is at in their journey then and there. And then sometimes the way that I describe it is I'm coming in as a little energy ball into their business to help propel them to the next stage. So that could be fundraising. It could be, I run a lot of business planning workshops. That's something that I do quite a lot. I have a business plan template that I've developed, and I will sit with the founders and I will do normally like a 3-hour workshop where we literally go through the whole template. We talk about what their mission and vision is, and we then try and translate that into the document. Obviously, we don't write the whole document in that workshop, but we'll discuss the general business plan, their strategic growth targets. I'm a very big planner, so I'll also try and get them to a place where they've decided where they want to be within 3 years, and then we figure out what the financial targets are for each of those. I always want people to be thinking about when they're going to break even, because of course, from an investor perspective, that's what the investor wants to know as well. So I guess I think about it in terms of entrepreneurs, but also in terms of investors. And I think that kind of quite unique lens is often helpful for my clients. And yeah, so I suppose that's the way that I approach the calls and the way that I work with them. But in terms of my sort of list of services, I would say it's like helping them to establish their vision and mission statements, the business plan development. Sometimes I'm even doing sales training. I did a sales training workshop a couple of weeks ago because that's what they needed. They're an amazing team of psychiatrists, but really don't have much commercial experience. So I was going in and saying, okay, well, this is how you run a sales process. This is how you qualify a lead, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then other times I'm doing fundraising. So I'm either sort of, networking with the investment community and putting them in touch with investors. Sometimes I'm helping them with their pitch materials. It is super, I manage like a PR firm for one of the clients. So it's really just whatever people need help with. And obviously sometimes my skill set doesn't suit it. But I think most things that are commercial or are to do with business plans or fundraising, I can, for the most part, help businesses with. So yes, that's an overview anyway of Mission Good.
No, and that's really, I feel that when an entrepreneur is setting out, a lot of those things are so important, and they're looking we are all struggling, right? We are all trying to figure it out. And if there's somebody who comes in and supports with that, that'll be a huge boon in a way for a business to kind of take off. So just two connected questions. One, how do they find you? What's the best way for you to get found by them? Because if they don't find you, then, like, it's kind of, they're still kind of shooting in the dark, because they need to be able to find you. And then the second part is, many of them may be bootstrapped, and how do you tackle that part? Because of course, you need to be compensated for the effort that you're making, but many times they may not be able to pay you up front. So do you have different mechanisms? Do you go for equity, or you don't do that, but you find a way to figure that out so that the work continues to happen? So those
Mm.
two would be great to hear.
I actually think you've raised a really, really good question there, because I don't actually think that's talked about enough. So I'll answer the second question first, as it's more front of mind. So yeah, it is difficult, because it also depends on the type of business that you're running. So I was recently speaking to this amazing woman who, I won't share her personal story. She's very open about it, but I won't share that here. But she's got this incredibly raw, actually, personal story, which is why she decided to found this business, which basically helps people with their trauma through an AI platform that she's developed. But obviously, with that, there are certain regulations that you need to consider, because you're dealing with mental health and patient care and things like that. And she was way too early for me to be able to work with her, but I put her in touch with people that I felt could add value to her, or would be able to help her, perhaps in the healthcare industry. So someone like that, that's extremely early stage, and also in an industry that needs more support than if you're launching, for example, like an ethical clothing business, which is, I would say, like lower barriers to entry. I will basically try and connect them with the right people. And then you probably have a level up from that, which is companies that are seeing a little bit of traction, maybe have done a small friends and family round, and I will then try and match any SEIS investors with them, or maybe they need help with their pitch materials, etc. And then a level up from that is people that are more probably EIS, and to be honest, this is where most of my work is, and I will work with them in a much more in-depth way. And often at that point they've raised some capital, so they can afford to put me on maybe a retainer. Sometimes I go above the retainer, but I try to sort of stick to the retainer, as in I'll go above the retainer for free because I just want to help them. But I'll try and stick to the retainer, and in that time frame we'll agree really quite specific tasks or things that need to be delivered. And I always make sure that my role is very, very defined. Despite the fact that there can be a variety of services that I can offer to them. So does that sort of answer the second question? And if you could just remind me of the first question, I could answer that one too.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. That does answer the second question, that you have a pretty open system, but it's also very clear on the delivery and the specifics. But the first question was, how do they find you? Because
Oh, of
lots
course.
of entrepreneurs need a guide like you, but it can't just happen through an internet search, right? So how does that happen? How do you get discovered?
Yeah, so I thought this was going to be much more difficult than it is, actually. Like, I suppose a fear of mine when I start, I'm very good at like networking and, being in events, networking with founders, and I'm very plugged into the space anyway. Like, I'm part of tons of WhatsApp groups. I run a few of my own networks. I run a network for net zero professionals. I run a network for freelancers in the UK. So I'm part of a lot of communities. But I thought, okay, so how easy is it going to be to translate, not necessarily from those communities, but sort of my general networking skills, I guess, into clients? But actually, I found that so much of my work comes from referrals, which I'm very grateful for. I haven't had to really go out and hunt for business. The only thing that I do, well, not the only thing I do, but one of the main things that I do is I try and do a lot of LinkedIn posts that add value to my audience. And my audience is obviously a mixture of investors and entrepreneurs for the most part. And so for example, I did a post the other day on, it was like what not to do when you're fundraising. And I got quite a few investors that liked it, unsurprisingly, but also quite a few founders that liked it. And then one of my main clients at the moment found me through LinkedIn because they'd seen some of my content. They reached out to me and said, we'd love to have a call. So I met with him, and then I met the founding team, and I was, up and running pretty quickly after that. And I've worked with them for, I think, about 3 or 4 months, and love the team there. They're a wonderful team. So I think those two mechanisms, but also I suppose people do reach out to me through a lot of these communities. But I find that the communities, it's more of a value exchange rather than monetary exchange. So I just sort of honestly help people for free most of the time, and I just say, oh, have you looked at this accelerator, or have you thought about this in your fundraise, or maybe you're too early, maybe focus on traction first, or whatever it is. Like, I'll just try and offer some sort of complimentary advice. And then I also have a blog that I run on Medium. So sometimes I'll interview investors. Sometimes I'll just write sort of generally about, say, the circular economy or sustainability at large. Or I did a piece actually that got picked up quite a bit, which was the link between psychology and climate change. And that as a niche is really, really interesting. But yeah, there's a company called, I think it's called Aluminum, which featured me as like one of the most read articles or something on their website. So that was quite nice to get some traction there. So you do get more eyeballs through that. And then recently, and it's not come out yet, but Business Green reached out to me for sort of some PR piece where they wanted me to answer certain questions on sustainability and sort of my advice and how the industry is going to be changing moving forwards and things like that. So also someone in theory could read about something in the press and reach out to me, but that's probably something that I'm focusing more on now. I don't know, I find that PR sort of comes and goes, and it's not something I focus on, but if somebody reaches out to me, I'll always respond with my thoughts. I feel like I do a lot of other stuff as well. What else do I do? I also have an Instagram account that I run, and I focus very much on testimonials as my marketing play there. So I'll ask someone that I've worked with if they're happy for me to do a testimonial with them. They have always said yes so far, which is great. And I'll then post that across my social media. So that obviously also helps to sort of build value with my audience. But yeah, I mean, apart from anything else, like for anyone listening that wants to just network more in the industry, there are so many amazing events in our industry now, like impact-led investment summits, sustainability events, communities. Like, please just plug yourself into as many communities as you can. I could go on, but I'll stop there.
And that's a pretty comprehensive methodology to kind of be visible, and hopefully it's even going beyond Britain and United Kingdom, and going beyond that, and we'll get into the bits about how you are thinking about scaling up towards the end. But let's get into more advisory mode. So what do you see as the largest challenges for capital in the sustainability or the climate change space? Of course, there's a lot of people who talk about it, but where do you see the most challenges coming in from an investor perspective when they think about investing? What should a entrepreneur be aware of?
Yeah, so I think it's a good question, and I think it's particularly prevalent at the moment because I think most people know it's not the easiest market to fundraise in because of some of the major macroeconomic challenges that we've had. I would say, in terms of what people should be thinking about, you probably want to. Well, I think the first thing to say actually is that supply and demand. So obviously there are way more entrepreneurs and fundraising companies than there are investors. There are a lot of investors in the space, but there are always more fundraising companies. So I used to work at an angel syndicate, which I actually forgot to mention earlier, but I used to work at an angel syndicate, and they've received hundreds and hundreds of pitch decks, like hundreds. And then I've recently started working with a fund, and I mean, you're talking like thousands of pitch decks sometimes in a year. And I did some maths recently, and one fund that I know accepts something like, or rather they invest in, it's like 2.03% of companies that apply to them. So for the most part, it's actually very difficult to get funding in the first place because of the imbalance of supply and demand. And sort of the same with grant funding. So the recent Innovate UK Smart Grant, and you can win sort of £200,000 or whatever for your project. So it's quite a large amount of money. But, again, I worked out what that was, and I think it was 2.6%. No, 2.7. It was 2.67%. So if we round it up, 2.7% of companies won that grant. So I just want to take a moment to appreciate, like, there's a lot of people that are out there fundraising, and that is the level, that we're dealing with. Like, that's how many companies are actually getting investment. So it is challenging, and really, what investors want to see is traction. They want to see traction, and the valuation should be appropriate based on that traction. But fundamentally, they also want to see scale. So I think I have seen a couple of companies recently that are amazing ideas and do add value and do make a difference, but they don't really have the scale. And obviously, tech can scale probably more easily than any other company or any other industry. So yeah, and then I also think, like, matchmaking. So creating a target list of funders that are actually relevant for your business. So, if you're in the circular economy, who's invested in your competitors? Like, go on Crunchbase, look at your competitors, who's invested in them. Are they SEIS level? Are they EIS level? Do they invest in the UK? Do they care about tax efficient investment schemes that we have? Like, and how much of their fund have they deployed? Because a lot of the time, the way that certainly a fund normally operates is that they'll spend time raising capital. Then once they've raised that capital, they'll then obviously look at investment opportunities and deploy the funds. But once the funds are then deployed, then they're capital raising again. So you actually have to meet that fund at the right time for them to even be able to invest in your business. And there's a fund that I've started working with recently, who I know and they have something called the Evergreen Fund to solve that problem. So now they just consistently fundraise, consistently deploy capital, which means that companies are coming to them at the right time all the time, sort of thing. So that helps. But certainly, getting your pitch deck right, problem, solution, traction, investment ask, investment traction. Those are the 5 things that you need in your pitch deck. Those are the 5 things that you need in your pitch. Make sure that you can explain your business in 1 or 2 sentences max, especially when you're going to, an investor networking event. And really, I find that there's a lot of, I keep using the word velocity at the moment. There's a lot of velocity with a fund or a VC or an angel, if they like it. If they don't like it, they're probably not getting back to you that much, or they're probably interested in other investment opportunities. It's a bit like dating. If somebody's asking you for your second date pretty quickly, they probably like you. If they're spending 2 weeks getting back to you, maybe they're dating someone else. It's like, it's the same thing, but just with regards to fundraising. So again, it's all about psychology. What is someone's body language like on a call? Are they open and speaking with their hands like I am right now? Are they kind of sat back and having their arms folded? Read someone's body language. Like, how interested and engaged are they? What kind of questions are they asking you? Something I could go on and on and on, but like, I also recommend with every investor call I have, I will write down every question that they've asked. And then I will put that into a repository on the Google Drive, and I will map and the patterns. So 40% of investors are asking us about this, and so therefore you then create materials that align with the questions that they're asking, and then put that into your data room, so that when you share the data room with them, they're more likely to have their FAQs answered. I'm even creating an FAQ document with one of my clients at the moment, because we're getting the same questions again and again. And maybe it's useful for people to have that as well as hearing it on a call. So, be creative, put yourself in their shoes, and go from there.
That's so brilliant. You've put it so well. I'm sure lots of people who listen to this will benefit from that, because you kind of answered my next question. So I'm not even going to end, which was around how should a founder find investors, but you kind of inferred to it, and you can expand on it along with my next thought, which is, what are the mistakes that you find founders or entrepreneurs make while seeking funding?
Okay, so let me just write those 2 questions down. So, so the mistakes they're making, and then how do they find investors? Okay.
What's the best way to go about finding the right investors?
Yeah, so I think the first thing that people need to realize, and it might sound obvious, but I don't know if this lands with everyone, is that investment is about trust. Like, especially with angels, people are putting their hard-earned money into your company. It's not a hobby. They want something in return, but it's also their hard-earned money. So everything is about trust, which is why, of course, angel syndicates work so well. Because if one person trusts another person and that person has found a particularly interesting company, they're obviously more likely to look at it, read the DD materials, and then invest in it than they are if it's someone random that said, "Oh, I found this company the other day. What do you think?" They're obviously going to be less likely to look at that. So trust needs to be built, and how if you think about what your quickest route to market is, it's probably people that already trust you. So obviously you start with the friends and family round because they trust that you're going to use their money wisely and hopefully generate a decent return for them. So do create target lists, but even better than that, try and find people that know the partners or the investment associates or whatever at those companies and give you a warm introduction, because they're going to trust the intermediary more than you, which is why people probably like to use people like me, because I have this list of investors and VCs and funds that I work with, and hopefully they trust my judgment, and so I would never put them in front of a company that I didn't feel had the legs to at least be worth a call. So yeah, think about that. How do you build trust with someone? And a lot of the time how you build trust with them is keeping your promises. So if you said that you're going to generate £10,000 by December, make sure you're doing that. How are you going to do it? And then when it comes to December, call up your investor. By the way, I hit that target I said I was going to hit. This is what they want to hear. But also I think and I'm slightly going off topic, but I also think, tell investors when something's going wrong, because they want you to take feedback well, they want you to listen to it, and they want you to pivot and adapt in order to make something a success. But back to how you find them. So yeah, you could use, PitchBook, Crunchbase, I think it's called Boohurst, I always pronounce it wrong. But these are like data-driven tech organizations that look at who has invested in companies that are similar to yours. So that's what I've done for a client at the moment. I've created that target list, but then I'm using my contacts, showing them that list and saying, do you know anyone at any of these companies? And for the most part, they always say yes. They might not know all of them, but they might know one or two. And that's how you get a call in the diary within 3 days of reaching out to someone. Of course, some companies also will ask you to submit their pitch deck on the website. So if you're doing that, make sure that your pitch deck is really slick. Don't have like 30-page pitch decks, like try and keep it to maybe 10 to 15 pages. You're really just enticing somebody to want to have a call with you. And I also think make sure that you're talking about your exit strategy. This is something that I hardly ever see on pitch decks, and I don't know why. Like, picture yourself as the investor. Like, they want to know how they're going to get their money back. So are you selling to, a bank? Are you planning on doing an IPO? Within what time frame are you planning on doing that? Think about all of these things. Put yourself in their shoes. So how do you find investors? I think I've covered that. Mistakes they're making, I'm sort of starting to cover that. I think other mistakes are, I had a call the other day, very nice founder, but I dialed into the call and they spoke at me for 15 minutes about their product. And I'm a real stickler for you start the call, ask them how they are, understand what mood they're in. Have they had a terrible day? Are they in back-to-back calls all day? If I dial into a call and someone says, oh my God, it's been such a crazy day. Sorry, I was a few minutes late to the call. I haven't even eaten lunch and it's 4 p.m. I'll then go, oh, don't worry. I'll turn my camera off, go and grab a drink, grab a snack, and I'll see you back in 5 minutes. Because the other thing people need to realize is people are people, not robots. And I think a lot of the time we're seen as these productivity engines as founders, and to be honest, not just founders in any industry, but we're humans. So check in with the human that you're speaking to, see how they are. Do they need a bathroom break before the call? Do they need to grab themselves a coffee because they've had a crazy day? Or are they in a really happy mood and actually they've got loads of time? So yeah, come onto the call, figure out how someone is in that moment, see if they need a little break before the call. Ask them what their hard stop is. So if the call is for half an hour, do they have a hard stop at past, or can they go to another 15 minutes to make sure that you're managing your time appropriately on the call? Then I would always set an agenda. So obviously introductions is normally first, and then maybe you go and understand their investment criteria if it's an investor. Then talk about, do your pitch, I suppose, and then allow time for Q&A, and then talk about next steps. So I think managing a call really well, I think that mistake can often be made because people are so excited to talk about their product, but that's not always the best way to start a call. I mean, as I say, I did a post on this on LinkedIn the other day, like things not to do. I think that's kind of one of the main ones that sticks out to me. And definitely like receiving and like absorbing feedback. So I think sometimes it can be quite easy to be defensive when an investor is saying, oh, okay, well, it sounds interesting, but I'm not quite sure about this. I'm not quite sure about that. And not sure about the IP defensibility, for example. Like take that in, go, okay, think about it. Is that a legitimate concern? Is that just something that I haven't explained well enough? And if you're not sure about something, you can say, thank you for raising that. That is important to me that we get that right. So let me think about that and come back to you. In the meantime, let's talk about X. So make sure you're addressing their concerns, because you also want to work in partnership with any investor that you take on. I mean, some investors will literally make the investment and really just disappear and want their quarterly update. But a lot of investors want to know their investment's going well, or if it isn't going well, they want to help you. And of course, most investors have made their money because they've maybe sold a business or they've had some sort of success in some way. So use them, ask them questions, maybe get them as an advisor on the board or whatever feels appropriate. So work more collaboratively with them. I'll probably pause there, but there are probably more things I could say.
Yeah, no, those are great, great inputs. One of the things that comes up, and it's always a challenge, is the dilution bit. Like how much do you give? How much equity do you kind of give away? And of course, it's a balancing act, right? From an investor perspective and a founder or entrepreneur perspective, that like ultimately, yes, you can value it at whatever you want, but it's a negotiation end of the day. So, how should founders look at the dilution? Of course, the investors, of course, have their own mechanism to kind of look at how much they are willing to, how little or how much equity they would want for their investment. But what would your guidance be to founders? Because that's a challenge that we all will face when we are raising capital.
Yeah, so I almost want to answer this, but in a slightly different way. So, and because it happened recently with a client I've been working with, and I sort of asked them how they worked out their valuation, and I wasn't that satisfied with the answer. And what I was saying to them is, there are different ways to value a business, and like you might be early stage, but there are still lots of different valuation methodologies. So have a read about those valuation methodologies. If you don't feel comfortable with them, talk to your CFO, talk to your accountant. Maybe not your, well, yeah, or like a valuation expert, somebody that knows about valuations and how to value your company. It is difficult. And I've seen a lot of posts recently almost like pushing back on VCs setting the terms of the round. But I think, yeah, you need to, if you're going to ask for money, you need to know why your company is worth that, and you need to have a valuation methodology behind you as to how you've got to that number. So I think that's almost like more important than anything else. And then also thinking about your, being strategic about your fundraise. So, okay, we're going to fundraise X, which is going to give us X runway. We then might expect to raise that amount in, next year. But like, be realistic about when you're going to need to raise again on a worst case scenario, a medium case scenario, and a best case scenario, and then plan accordingly, so that at least when you're talking about dilution or when you're talking about any kind of investment in general, people understand the plan. Because I had an angel recently invest in one of the companies I'm working with, and he was very open with me about his financial situation, explained that any company he invests in, he also wants to keep money back to do a follow-on round. So the investors will have that in mind too. So like, do you want to make a one-off investment? Are you planning to perhaps come in for a follow-on round? You may not want to ask them that, but think about these things. But yeah, when it comes to dilution, I would talk that through with the investor and talk about your plan. I hope that helps.
Yeah, it's such a balancing act. So I'm glad you kind of threw some light. And what the gist I got is to have very good methodologies on how you've kind of calculated your value of the company, and hence the investment, and hence the dilution. And of course, the investor will have their own methodology for those calculations. So it's always a good balancing act. Okay, looking at the space that we are in, and you are of course a proponent for climate tech and that domain, and it's hot, like lots of people talk about it. But what I also find is that, especially the space that we focus on, which is sustainable regenerative packaging, that's not given enough of a limelight. So do you see traction happening in that space? There is a huge amount of talk on the plastic crisis, but I see, in terms of the amount of money flowing in, when you look at the energy sector, for example, it's like 100x, literally, and it is a huge challenge, and from a carbon perspective, that becomes more important. But so is this segment of sustainable packaging. So, what would your take be on the sustainable packaging side, and how do you think the firms who are trying to work in this space can gain more traction?
Yeah, so I'm actually really glad you asked this, because funnily enough, I'm working with a circular business at the moment, and they're trying to reduce single-use plastic by working with the reuse network. So I've actually got some stats that I prepared for this podcast to share, using some of the data from that business. So obviously, the first thing to say is that there will be a gradual reduction in single-use and increase in alternative materials and growth in reuse. Like, that's pretty obvious. But the bit I wanted to share was that at the moment, and this is not a complete list, but 14 reuse networks, so the likes of Vital, Recup, Recircle, for anyone that knows the space, for the 14 that we have in our list, they actually process today 21.1 million items per annum. So what that means is that, and I know it's hard to picture if you're in the UK because it doesn't happen as much in the UK, but if you're in, say, Germany, a lot of the cafes in Germany actually have one of these systems like Vital or Recup, for example, and you take your reusable cup with your cup of coffee in it, you take it away, drink it, and then you come back and you deposit it back in the cafe. And so that sort of transaction, as it were, that's what's happening 21.1 million times per annum at the moment. So that's a good place to be. Obviously, we need to be much further forward. And actually, some countries now have put a stake in the ground and said, for example, with Dubai, by January 2026, they will see a ban on single-use plastic cups, lids, single-use plastic cutlery, plastic food containers, and plastic plates. So that's not all of single use, but that's a significant portion of it. And then Monaco, for example, aims to ban all single-use plastics by 2030. So, we're in 2024 now, like obviously coming up to the end of the year. So literally within 5 or 6 years, some countries will completely ban single-use plastics. And so that leaves us with either the reuse industry, which is the bit I've just described, or, and probably what you're very familiar with, is biodegradable packaging potentially. So packaging made from seaweed. So the other day I went to a cafe. I chose to eat in to have my, I think it was a hot chocolate, deliberately so that I wouldn't be given a disposable cup. And then they gave me this disposable, I guess single-use plastic cup for my hot chocolate, and I was not happy about it. So I said to them, I've chosen to eat in because I wanted to have it in a mug. And they said, oh, no, don't worry. It's actually biodegradable. It's made from seaweed. So I thought, oh, okay. And I felt a bit better about my cup. But certainly there are lots of alternative materials that are now being used in packaging. And actually work with another company that is producing packaging that is, I suppose it's more reuse again, but they're working with like coffee chains. And so actually when the coffee is delivered, even, it's in this reusable packaging. They give it over to the cafe. The cafe then takes that coffee, presumably puts it into another container, or maybe just takes it out of that container. And then when it's finished and they're ready to get their new batch, they will hand back that item and I suppose it's just refilled, actually. It's probably washed and refilled. I don't know exactly how it works. But then they give that back. So it is happening. It's just a bit gradual. And I do find that if you work in sustainability or the circular economy or whatever, you're aware it's happening. If you're the average Joe public, you might not know it's happening. So I think the awareness needs to be driven. And if countries like Monaco are going to eradicate all single use by 2030, people will start seeing it. Obviously, if you live in Monaco, you'll see it more, well, sooner rather than later. But in the UK, there's a trial happening in Scotland with, I think it's City to Sea, which is one of the reuse networks. And even companies like Starbucks and Costa are involved in that trial. So it might be the case that we soon walk into a Costa and have that reusable cup, which is great. Okay.
Yeah, so taking a cue from what you're saying, I see that there are changes happening for sure, but that's a large space of climate tech, and the sustainable packaging people are playing within that space. So, what would your guidance be to founders and entrepreneurs in that space in particular, in order to gain kind of traction from investors who are looking at energy and various other kind of possibilities for climate tech, automobiles and all of that. So how does sustainable packaging in particular gain more traction?
I think with that question, it's hard to answer in a sense, because at the end of the day, impact is impact, and people want to invest in good companies that are scalable, they're going to generate a decent return and have a big impact. So I think the only thing that would stop anyone from investing in that type of company is if they've already got an investment in that type of company. So like, I almost don't think it's any different from any other sustainable startup. Make sure that you understand the investment thesis of any angel or any VC or any fund or whatever that you're going to speak to. Do your background research, have a look at their existing portfolio, and see who else they've invested in the past. I know that one fund I spoke to recently said that 75% of their fund invests in companies that were making a direct impact, i.e., kind of the seaweed cup type companies. And then 25% of it is almost like the tech that helps enable those companies, or essentially like has more of an indirect impact, and it's harder to track the exact kg of waste reduced, for example. So I mean, I think my advice is similar to kind of earlier on the podcast, and I was mentioning, make sure that you can track as much as you can do the impact that you're having, the waste that you're reducing as a result of your product. Try and get as much traction as you can. I mean, letters of intent are great. You don't want to put everything on the letters of intent, but certainly if you've got letters of intent and you can work out your financial projections based on those, and those letters of intent have very clear kind of green light moments as to when they will actually happen. So somebody saying I'm interested in doing this but without a time frame isn't very helpful. But if they say by January 2025 we would like to go live with a trial, so proof of concept is very important as well. I mean, if you're speaking to an investor pre-proof of concept, it's a very different conversation to post-proof of concept. So make sure that you've got those pilots, those trials, if you are an early stage business. And if you're a later stage business, have you got decent traction? How much have you raised in the past? If you've raised a lot of money, hopefully you've got a lot of traction. If you haven't, why haven't you? Are you making sure that you're applying for your R&D tax credits to come back? Investors want to know that you're looking after your money well. So a client of mine's just got a massive tax rebate, which is wonderful. Make sure that you're also kind of up to date on how you can get funding back, as well as asking for funding.
Those are really important, insights. I think that anybody listening would really benefit from those kind of clear, incisive ideas. And the one that I actually really appreciated was doing our research well. What is the investor investing in? What are they really interested in? One of the things that you mentioned just a little while back was, and you took the example of Monaco and Dubai, is the policy framework and legislation. And that, of course, plays a huge role in any climate tech kind of business, and especially in the sustainable packaging space, because it's so led by what ban is there. So, is that something that the entrepreneurs should actively be looking at and being part of those discussions? Or do you think that should be left to the activists? How do you see that? And does that make an impact to the investors, whether we actively involved in the space of policy and legal frameworks?
I think that's really interesting. My answer, I mean, this is also a personality thing. Like, this is my personality as much as anything else. But I think everyone should have a voice, 100%. So some people, though, aren't comfortable doing that. Like, I have friends that sort of care about the issue, but maybe don't feel comfortable protesting, for example. But you can say, I mean, something that I've done recently is I created, in collaboration with one of my clients, a policy template to give to councils, which asks the council to prioritize and prefer B Corp organizations as part of the tender processes. So something like that you can definitely do as an entrepreneur, and it may or may not get approved, but find ways that you can increase your likelihood of winning business. But when it comes to legislation, I mean, you can write white papers. I think definitely like going on podcasts and writing blogs and things like that helps as well. And it almost sometimes doesn't matter how large the audience is. I mean, there's a story that I love. I might just share this very quick anecdote. So there was somebody that was producing a podcast series a few years ago on dating. It's the guy from the Married at First Sight guy, but I can't remember his name. Anyway, he was producing this podcast series, YouTube series of videos talking about dating. And somebody that worked with Oprah saw this video, and he was getting like 12 views on his YouTube videos. But one of those 12 views was somebody that worked with Oprah. Oprah reached out to this guy and said, I think you're saying some really interesting stuff. Do you want to like come on my show, or do you want to have a meeting, or whatever it was? And that propelled his career. So sometimes it's important. Yeah. So these podcasts are important, talk about issues that matter, because you never know who's listening. And, anyone that is listening, even if it's one of you, even if it's, 100,000 of you, please, I hope that you do take something from this podcast and take action as a result of it. Even if it's like, learning more about, for example, Client Earth, who are a firm that are trying to change legislation in the industry, and they basically take governments to court to try and create change. Like, look them up, get involved with them, volunteer for Friends of the Earth, do something in your community. I think we all play a part. And about a month ago, I actually asked ChatGPT, how do we solve the climate crisis? Just to see what it would say. And it said every single individual, organization, school, investor, everything needs to contribute to solve this crisis. And I think that's my answer.
That's wonderfully put. And I'm sure, hopefully, some people will look at it from an individual perspective and contribute in that direction too. Okay, taking our conversation towards closure, what are the most exciting climate solutions that you see on the horizon, and the ideas that you are excited about in the current time?
Oh gosh, it's such a big question. Everything. Like, I love innovation, and I think particularly in hard to abate industries, I'm quite interested to see what's going to happen there. So I'm working with one company that is in a hard to abate industry in manufacturing, and they having to change or basically overhaul their whole manufacturing process. So at the moment, they're very reliant on gas, and we've tried to look at alternative ways of running the factory on things like green gas, but there are a lot of solutions that just aren't where they need to be for us to implement them, especially at the volume that we would need. So things like, robotic manufacturing processes, I think, are really fascinating, because it means that you can run the factory off electricity. That electricity can then obviously be done using renewable energy and things like that. I would also like to see more people talking about how AI and technology is powered. So I don't know if people know much about the crypto space, but actually cryptocurrency is really bad for the environment because of the electricity that's used for servers. And so AI is going to have is having the exact same problem. And I remember I invested in, I think it's Cardano, which is the only cryptocurrency that's environmentally friendly, or at least it was at the time that I invested. So I think also be really mindful of, it's not just like a cup that's the problem. It's also how technology is evolving, and all sorts of things. So I like to see innovation in every place, but yeah, particularly hard to abate industries, how they're going to turn things around, because often they're the ferry rather than the speedboat. And I think like particularly sustainable aviation fuels I'm really interested in. So, somebody that likes to travel but feel that they can't, which is probably a lot of people listening to this podcast, and maybe even the people doing this podcast, because I know I feel like that. How can we still travel, but travel in a way that's not super damaging to the environment? And I think it's by 2035, Wizz Air are running an aircraft on an alternative fuel. And I know Virgin have already done it. They completed a flight. And then Solar Impulse. Do you know anything about Solar Impulse? The solar powered plane. I'm super interested in like the aviation space and how we can solve that, because at the moment, as we know, the Eurostar is really expensive and unreliable. Like train travel is really expensive if you want to do like interrailing. I mean, literally, someone that I work with kind of refuses to fly, but it takes him like 3 days to get somewhere versus a few hours. So what we have at the moment doesn't work. So I'd quite like to see, an involvement of solutions in the travel space and fuels. I am interested in packaging. I think that's important. But yeah, manufacturing, construction's a really interesting one. So looking at more natural building materials and things like that in the construction space. And yeah, I don't know. I would love to get to a point where people care more as well. Just there's a lot of cognitive dissonance. People. I mean, Del Vince talks about the cow in the room. There's a lot of people that care about sustainability but don't have a plant-based diet. I would say like 80% of my diet is plant-based. Not 100%, but certainly 80% at least is plant-based. And if I had to leave people with something, it's almost like progress, not perfection. What are the things that you can do in your life, and how can you influence others and governments, or even just your best friend, to make better choices, because we are defined by the choices that we make.
So beautifully put, and so many ideas there. Of course, I was hoping it's going to be all sustainable packaging, but that's all right.
I am super interested in that as well, I have to say. Like, I mean, the fact that I was given that cup that was seaweed and was going to biodegrade, I was very happy about that. So don't get me wrong, that's also a great space.
No, that's just selfish interest. But okay, so of course you're doing such amazing things with Mission Good, and I just think that this is so valuable. The ideas that you're bringing in for founders and handholding them so that they can progress in the path that they've chosen. But how do you see Mission Good evolving beyond Jenny? Because again, you need to do so much more. So are you looking at building Mission Good like to find other people who join you, and how do you see growth for yourself in the next 3 to 5 years?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question. And it's definitely grown a lot already over the last year and a half, and it's evolved so much. I started with a few clients that were super, super regular. And now I feel like I have a more varied portfolio. And also, people dipping in and out based on their needs. So like, sometimes someone will contact me and say, oh, I'm really struggling with this, and I'll just do like an afternoon workshop with them or whatever. And that seems to be working for now. I think if I'm being really honest, I would say at the moment my goals are fairly commercial. Like I have commercial targets in mind that I want to reach. So that's kind of my immediate goal. In terms of where it goes beyond that, I mean, it's a really good question, because I think part of the challenge is that I'm really acting as a consultant in a lot of ways, based on my experience. So it's quite difficult for me to employ people at the moment, because they may not have the same experience or lens. And, at the moment I can manage the workload. Like I'm sort of at capacity. But I want to see how that goes for a bit. And honestly, I'm really more focused about just delivering good work now. And then I think I will just naturally see how it evolves based on the needs of the industry. Obviously the budget is coming out later this month as well. It'll be interesting to see what will change there. Not that it's going to change our industry massively, but there's a target of 1.5 million houses that we need to build. But are they going to do that in an ethical way? Are they going to set out certain things that need to be done in the house building sector, for example? So I don't know. I kind of want to see what happens there. But at the moment, it's a very small team, but lots of interesting work. And maybe we'll have another conversation in a year, and I'll tell you then what the plan is. But for the moment, it's just really focusing on delivering good work, and just getting to that next commercial milestone.
Yeah, no, that's a good target too. My wife talks about depth instead of width many times, and that's kind of what you're mentioning. That keep going deeper and do good work, and that's so important as well. Of course, and this is always my last question, and I'm really intrigued in your case what your answer would be. So, what does good garbage mean to you?
So I think good garbage is responsibility. I think so. People taking ownership of their waste and really thinking about it. So every time you put something in the bin, also like, what does your local council do? Do you even know what you can recycle? So I think like education is important. I mean, I'm quite lucky that my local council do actually send us like a leaflet every year, which I read every year. So it tells you the things that you can recycle, the things that you can't recycle. And I think just be as mindful as you can about your waste. And I think kind of like batch cooking can be quite helpful as well, because then you're not using as much single use, items. So if you buy a massive sack of potatoes and make loads of mashed potato for the week, that's probably better than if you're buying little bits here and there. So yeah, I think good garbage to me is about responsibility, trying to do the right thing, but thinking that it's progress, not perfection.
I love it. Nobody has talked about batch cooking so far in our whatever 60 episodes that we've done. So thank you. I was expecting something like that would come out, you know, just knowing you in the last hour or so. Thank you so much, Jenny, for being on the show. This has been such an insightful conversation and inspiring in so many ways. And I'm sure there'll be so many tidbits for investors as well as entrepreneurs coming into the space just from the insights that you bring. And you have such a good heart, and I think that just shines through. And you have a good heart with a lot of chutzpah. So that's also a great thing, like where you bring in so much value. So thank you so much for being on the show. Thank you for the work you're doing. I'm excited about the changes that you're going to bring to this world. So thank you for being you.
Thank you so much. That's very, very sweet and very kind. And, I would say, I would echo the same back to you. So, it is really important to spread awareness of these issues. It's important to grow an audience. And as we've discussed, it doesn't matter how many people are listening. The important thing is that they are listening, they are taking action. And, so thank you for the work that you do to help spread awareness of some of these issues also.